Thank you very much. First of all, I'm delighted to be here, and I want to thank Yesenia for inviting me and working to get me here. And of course, Larry Nespoli has been a great partner with us, and we look forward to working with him. And then Dr. La Perla Morales, thank you for hosting us at this. I always comment that, yes, we have beautiful buildings at Teachers College, but most of the community colleges I go to have nicer facilities than we have, and this is certainly one of them, so we're delighted to be here. I know, we've been talking about this book for a while. Now I'm starting to feel like we're kind of getting repetitious, or people have already heard what we've had to say. I know that you have a Guided Pathways program going on here, so we're delighted to see that, and I'm going to say you'll probably have heard some of the things that I want to say today, but repetition is often a good thing for learning, and I hope that we can kind of add to what you're doing. Now you've had some experience already in doing this, some of the colleges, and thinking about how to do guided pathways. And so maybe in the Q&A we can get some people's response to that or insights that they've had. I want to say, I'm a researcher. I'm not in the classrooms with you, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about why it is we think this will work, what sort of evidence we've got. It's growing, and how we came to the conclusion of developing guided pathways and thinking that might be a good solution to that. So I will go through it. I'll do a little explanation of what that is. So really there's two observations that we've made that kind of led us to this. One was that the kind of flavor of the month reforms don't really change institutional performance, even if they work. Right, so I don't know, you've probably, has anybody else been, heard about flavor of the month reforms, or think that you've heard this before? This is another one of the things that have come along. I mean, one of the things I noticed when I first started studying community colleges, I went to a college, and this was in the late 90s, and the catalog had 30 pages of different funded reforms that were taking place. So we've seen a lot of those, and some of those are actually evaluated, and they seem to work with the students that are in them. But nevertheless, we don't see big improvements or even in many cases, any improvements in institutional performance or in the performance of the sector. Now, I think we're starting to see improvements, and Larry talked a little bit about that. So I think that's one point, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The other one is that we have set up colleges in a way that we think we've set them up, but they aren't operating in the way that we think they've done that. So those are sort of two observations that we've made that sort of started us down this road that led to the model that we're talking about. So, first of all, the idea, the typical reform history that we've had is, let's start a pilot program, let's do it with 100 students. When that's successful, we'll do it with the other 19,900 students that we have in the college. Now that rarely actually works, right? Think of an example of a pilot program you've known about that's actually then been scaled to the college. So that's one point, right? I mean, so we've certainly done that. I mean, we've looked at programs that are actually, if you take your program and you have a randomized study and you have a control group and the program group is successful, that's good, but if your learning community of 200 students is successful, what about the other 10,000 students? So it's going to be, it won't show up in your institutional performance. So that's one point, and I think that's kind of an obvious point. But the second point, which I sort of call vertical scaling, is something which isn't so obvious, which is a lot of the reforms are about one segment of the student experience. Developmental education is the perfect example, the beginning of the student experience. And then we find that in many cases, while those are successful, we can get more students into a college level course, let's say, or get them through that college level course. Then in studies that we've done, if you follow those students for 2 or 3 more years, the graduation rate doesn't go up. Their probability of graduating isn't significantly larger. So that's another, I think, one that's not so obvious, right? We've got, one is obviously if you only do 100 students, that's not going to affect your institution. But the other is a lot of the reforms are only for one segment. And I'll talk more about that. I think that's a fundamental issue about changing our notions about what it means to do reform. All right, so I said that I was going to talk about how our institutions aren't operating the way that we think they ought to operate. So we have 4 semesters. We're called two-year colleges. We know that very few students actually finish in that. And we expect students to go for full-time for 2 semesters. So that's what these are sort of semesters. The orange is going full-time and the blue is part-time. So a student might go full-time for a couple semesters, take a course in the summer, full-time for 2 more semesters, and then graduate. So you can think about, I'll show you this later, but you can think about this diagram as being every student is a slice. Okay, now this is a sample of 15,000 or 14,000 students. And this is a picture of what we think students are going to do. There's about 250 students out of the 15,000 that actually went through this college on this type of a pattern. And this is actually the picture of the way students actually go through. So now, once again, I know my staff always thinks this is a stupid slide to use because it's too complicated, but I think that's the point, right? Think about this as a slice for every student. Right? So every student starts out full or part-time. So the first semester, that's what we're expecting. And then it falls apart immediately. The dots, the little red dots, are when they transfer to a 4-year institution, and the blank whiteness is when they're not enrolled at all. So you can see lots of things from this. Students start full-time and they go part-time. So the whole notion of a full and part-time student isn't well defined. They switch all the time. So I think that So rather than having students moving through in the way that we expect them to do, in fact, students are in a much more chaotic type of pattern. What can we do to bring that together? Okay, another example is transfer. 2-year school, get your associate's degree, transfer to the 4-year college, finish your next 2 semesters, or next 2 years. Now, we know that most students in community colleges say they want to transfer and get a bachelor's degree. According to the NCES, the National Center for Education Statistics, about 80% of students say that that's what they want to do. Now, we can argue about whether that's realistic, but nevertheless, that's what they say. So what actually happens? So that's 1.6 million new community college students. 80% say they intend to transfer. 25% actually transfer to a 4-year college in 4 years. So already that's an issue. 20% transfers earn or award before they transfer. So most students who transfer don't actually complete an associate's degree before they transfer. So that's another question. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I think that's an issue. But nevertheless, it's not the way we've designed the college or designed our programs. And then 70% earn a bachelor's degree 6 years after they transfer. So that's most students want to transfer, and actually, most don't, and then even fewer actually complete. So this is a picture of the credits that students have when they transfer. So you can see that many students transfer with very few credits. That second bump there is the 60 credit, which is where we think. So it's not meaningless, but nevertheless, so you can see that people are transferring with all sorts of different levels of credit. And of course, what's really interesting is what those 100 credit students are doing. So there's some students taking many more credits than they need to complete their associate's degrees. Now, there's lots of reasons for that. All I'm trying to do is illustrate that, we're not having institutions that are operating, or students aren't moving through them in the way that we expect them to do that. Okay, one of the problems is, and let me get into the issue about the complication of our programs, is that, now I know that every college has a much simpler website than this, but this is a 4-year college actually, and this is the general education requirements, and these are, you select 12 courses from the list of over 300. So, there's some requirements for that. So, we put students, now, so when you think about that complicated slide before, one of the issues is, that's a complicated set of patterns, but we're putting students into a very complex institution, and that's what we see. So they're basically, in many cases, self-advising. Now, we realize our students aren't students that come with a lot of background. They don't have a lot of social capital. Their parents often didn't go to college. In New York City, many of them don't speak English, or the parents don't speak English. So they don't have a lot of background and knowledge that supports them in making the kind of decisions and figuring out what they want to do. We count on them to self-advise, and often this is the kind of thing that they encounter when they go to our websites and actually have those requirements. This is a little study that we did, and I really encourage you to go to your own websites and see what you can find. And we actually, in a smaller group, we do this as an exercise, and we ask everybody to get out their laptops, and we ask them to pick you're a student, you're in journalism, you want to transfer, you've taken this set of courses, find out which ones of those courses will transfer, what's the best place to transfer to, what are the requirements of those transfer institutions. And generally, I think if you do that, you'll find that it's very difficult for students to answer that, for you to answer it. And you're probably in a better condition to do that than the students. We did a little exercise with students at a college in Michigan. And we asked them a series of questions about which courses they ought to take, and 40% got those right. We said they had a particular interest, occupational interest, and then they were able to choose a program of study in a more reasonable way. And then we asked those types of questions about transfer, and only about 50% were able to do that. So I just think that if you have think about being a student and have a set of questions, and go to your websites and look at that. I think in almost all the cases where we've been able to do that in smaller workshops, that's been very illuminating to students. This is the exercise that we ask students to do. So I'm not going to ask you to do that now, but maybe in smaller groups or within your own college, you might try to do that if you haven't already done that. So what's the transfer experience that students have? So there's confusion about program requirements. Pathways lead to excess credits, time, and cost. So many students are transferring with more than 60 credits, as you can see from that. Often the credits that students have when they transfer don't count for their degrees in the 4 years, and especially don't count to their majors. Many of them haven't actually selected a major when they change. So that's one set of issues. As I said, transfer credits only count as electives. Many decide on majors too late or late. We'll talk much more about that. The information is often inaccessible. I mean, think about this really. I work at Columbia, and the environment that a Columbia undergraduate gets when they come to their school is much simpler than the environment that a community college student gets. And transfer is just one example, but that's a very big example. I think in New York City, you could take the subway to 20 four-year colleges. So if you're thinking about, well, where am I going to transfer to, and what do I need to do that transfer, that's a lot of complication. And it's very difficult to find out that information. We don't have enough advisors. I don't know what your percentages are, typical 1,000 to 1 percentages. So, and in a way, when you think about it, it's very complicated. It's difficult to think that advisors would actually be able to help you or would know enough to get you through that sort of thicket. The communications among 2- and 4-year institutions is very difficult in some cases. So that's that obviously varies. And we also find that students blame themselves. They don't understand, they can't get through the website, they can't get the information, it's something wrong with them. So that's a basic kind of a description of the problems with transfer. So I started out saying, well, students weren't moving through in the way that we expected them to move through. So these are some of the sort of summary of that. Chaotic student enrollment patterns, that's what I showed you. The pathways are misaligned and there are different roadblocks and difficult to understand, and students themselves are confused and actually perceive that it's a problem that they're having. Okay, so that's kind of a picture of a diagnosis of some of the issues that we're trying to confront so that students feel that they're lost in a maze. I think we would be lost in that maze too if we went into it and tried to work through it. So how do we make sense of complex institutions? So that's really what we have. What is it that we can do with our institutions that are confusing and complex to the students to make them easier to understand? And I think that this is the kind of MAPS idea that I think you're probably all working on if you're working on guided pathways. Defaults or active choice, and feedback and reminders. Now, if you think about, go back to the notion of reform. I mean, we talked about guided pathways, and we kind of chose the notion of pathways on purpose. So you think about how many of you are hikers? No hikers here? Well, there's a few hikers. All right. So when you go hiking, you go into the forest. There's a lot of things. You have a map. If you don't, you get lost. Now we have GPS. There are those blazes on the trees, and often there's like a path to go through, although if you are a hiker, if you try to follow the path, oftentimes you get off the actual path you're supposed to be on. So what is it that we do? What's a typical kind of reform that we have now if you want that analogy? Well, there's two kinds, right? One is that you get 100 students out of your 20,000, you give them a lot of services, and you take them through that forest. Now, that doesn't do anything for the other 19,000 students. The other one is that you get them in 100 yards into the forest, and then you let them go. So actually, most of our reforms do both of those. We take 100 students, we get them 100 yards into the forest, and then you let them go. So those are the two problems with that. So obviously, what we need to do is we need to design the colleges. There are two things. First of all, we need to make them simpler. And at the same time, we need to be able to provide information to students. So I think those things go together. We have to do a better job of advising. At the same time, we have to simplify what it is we're doing. So program structure. So one fundamental issue really is what it is we're doing with our college level program. Now, if you think about reform and all the reform you've experienced or you've seen, right? How much has talked about the college level program? After all, that's the fundamental thing that we're doing. That's the primary service that we're providing to these students. We're putting them into a program which is supposed to lead them somewhere. But nevertheless, most reform has not talked about that. So I think that when you're thinking about guided pathways, really the foundation of it is to try to create college level programs that are coherent and that are easy to understand. So this is this sort of comparison. I've talked about this. There's a confusing array of choices, and the alternative is a clearly defined, manageable choices. Now, one of the things that we get from behavioral economics is the notion of the default. And I think the reason that is convincing is that we all can see that. We all have 401ks. If somebody comes along and says, here are your 10,000 stocks, go for it. At least for me, I don't know, maybe you're all stock pickers. But for me, I say, okay, I'm leaving my money in the bank with its 0.2% interest. On the other hand, if somebody says, okay, here are 3 portfolios, low risk, middle risk, high risk, which would you like? I'm much more likely to choose one of those things. Now, I think we're using the 1,000 stock model for students. Let's give them the portfolio model. That's basically the fundamental idea. Now, the other question is the notion of exploration. So we have, we want students to be able to explore, so we give them, we let them do that. And often when we talk about having more structured pathways, people think, well, what about students? Aren't they supposed to explore? So that's true, but I mean, we're giving them, a bunch of hundreds of courses, and we say, okay, go through these things and on your own kind of explore. So that's, we want students to explore, but we want them to explore in a systematic way with help from us about how to do that exploring. The courses tend to be disconnected. I'm a professor. I don't want to connect my course to anyone else. I know exactly what my course should be. I'm sure that the professors here aren't as narrow as I am, but nevertheless, our programs are really built on courses. I mean, our schools are built on courses. Of course, there are in programs, but when is it that we say, okay, these are the learning outcomes that we want from these programs? Let's design backwards. I mean, so the learning outcomes come from thinking about either the employment outcomes that we want students to have or the educational outcomes if they're going to transfer and go on with their education. Have we sat down and say, what exactly are the skills and outcomes that we want for those students, and then plan backwards and incorporate those into the courses? So that's a more a more direct way of trying to think about what it is that we want to be in those programs. So this is one of the sort of pillars of this idea. More coherent programs that are well designed with learning outcomes at the program level. Okay. So this is just an example of how MiamiDade created these maps. I think you may all be engaged in this. They set up 4 disciplines, which was 80% of the enrollees, and you can read this: enabled seamless transfer to target bachelor's programs. Now this, of course, required them to be in contact with the 4-year college. MiamiDade actually has one college that its main target, so that makes their life a little bit easier than it's say in CUNY. But of course, CUNY has a system-wide way to do this. They had some gen ed learning outcomes that they incorporated into this. that satisfy the state gen ed core requirements, and then it created variants to full-time and part-time and developmental students. That's an important thing. It's easy to, if all our students were full-time, it would be easy to design a set of courses and a program, a semester by semester set of courses that they go through. What do you do about part-time students? So this is just an example of how to do this. Many other colleges are doing this, and so we can certainly provide different examples as you're trying to go through this process. All right, this is one example among many. Of the city colleges of Chicago have redesigned their programs, and they've just taken all of their programs and they put them into these 10 different buckets. So the idea is that when a student comes in, they may not be able to choose a narrowly defined program. I don't think we necessarily want them to do that, but they may know they're interested in health. So the idea here is that we would have a curriculum for that student that's in health that would give them their general education, basic type of instruction, and it's a default curriculum. So that if the student doesn't make any choices, this is what they have. It's well designed, it leads someplace. So that's kind of the idea, right, that we can, it's a compromise. If a student doesn't know exactly what they want to do, but they might have a general idea of what that, and then that general idea, that general field will put them through and provide a series of basic skills that they need in that area. Now, we certainly know that 18-year-olds or even 25-year-olds change their mind. So I think in designing these things, it's important that we think about what we're going to do with students who change their minds. I think, in this model, you certainly probably will lose some courses if you really change your mind. But as I said, if this starts out at a general enough level, many of the introductory basic courses that you're taking in these areas will apply to other fields. I mean, if you start out as a poet and you want to be a physicist, chances are you're going to have to take some extra courses. But nevertheless, lots of the courses if I think this is well defined, then these types of skills can be relevant across these different areas. Now this is just I know I always chuckle at this slide. I want everything to be simple, and this is an incredibly complicated slide. But nevertheless, it just tries to show the different, this is in a transportation logistics area. In Chicago, one college is sort of specialized in this. It's in an area where there's a lot of ports and railroads and other types of things. So lots of jobs in this area. And it shows the types of jobs that you can get with different levels of education. And this goes back to basic certificates, advanced certificates, associate's or bachelor's degrees. It then gives some information about if you want to get the bachelor's degree, what would be good transfer options. So once again, this is trying to work towards a website that provides the type of information that allows students to know, where they want to go or how to get to where they want to go, what's going to be at the end of the line, and what different types of degrees or educational pathways will lead them to that. So this is something else. I think you should go take a look at that. This is another part of their website, and you can see that you go to this page and you'll see a brief focus area overview. Then you see a sample career options for that, specific program offerings that lead to that, and you can see these are at 3 different levels, recommended transfer options, and finally sample courses. And what they do here is that they actually provide a semester by semester map of courses that a student can take. Now those are for full-time students, but as I said, they're working on trying to have alternatives that would be successful for part-time students as well. So the emphasis, and what I want to emphasize here is that there are many places that are trying to design these websites to provide the types of information so that if we sit down and ask ourselves the questions that I asked before, we would be able to answer those. There are many colleges in Tennessee that are doing that. Texas, ASU, this was really pioneered by 4-year colleges, Florida State, Georgia State, that have developed these types of maps and have been able to articulate them in their websites so that students can understand what they're doing. There's 2 things about the students that I think need to be addressed. One, do they have the skills that are needed? Now that's the thing that we think about most of the time. Our intake process in a community college is come in, you take an assessment, and most of our students are sent to developmental education. That's the fundamental thing we do. There's also a small advising session that perhaps takes place, not very long. Generally, that tends to be a help with a student choosing their first semester courses. We don't have time to help them figure out what it is they want to do with their lives. And I think a fundamental issue is, do we have a difference between a student who says, I know what I want to do, versus a student who says, I don't have a clue? Those are really different, and I think I think if a student knows what they want to do and we can't help them, then I think that's a problem that we have. We really ought to be able to do that. Now, it's much more difficult if a student doesn't know what they want to do, especially, now I've suggested that we have a limited number of guided pathways that students are going to go through. We can't just randomly distribute students across those pathways. So if we're going to do that, then we need to think about what that is. And I think that means devoting time and resources to this process. So there can be some work with the local high schools. I mean, other countries have a much more extensive set of services in the high schools to help students choose what they want to do, because of course in other countries often they have to choose, they go to a college in a particular area. They don't go to a college to find themselves for a couple of years. As I said, there's intake as placement exams. There's a short registration. Student success course is often optional or else very short, a one credit student success course. And the career counseling is something which is often done at the end, and it's often a building, or often it's in one of those trailers at the edge of the campus that students go to at the end, rather than being part of the integrated intake process that they need to have. And then often students, we don't really monitor the progress of students. I mean, it's often, do we know exactly where students are? You could see why that's difficult from that slide about the sort of chaotic enrollment patterns. All right, so this is just an example. How do we do this? And I think the fundamental question is, if this is an important issue, say that one reason that we have short student success courses is we got a lot of other courses that are necessary and we don't want to take away any credits from that. But if we think this is a very important function, then it's worth resources and credits. Student success courses are often college-level courses and students can get financial aid for that, et cetera, so it's not a non-credit thing. This is just an example of what Guttman Community College does at CUNY. They actually perhaps do a lot. They have essentially 2 semesters of ethnographies of work. They choose a program in the second semester. So they conduct in-depth investigations of specific occupations and careers, analyze data on trends involving salaries, benefits, et cetera, work on effective verbal. So this is the interesting thing about these courses. It's not just interest inventory or how to find a job. It also incorporates academic skills into what they're doing as well. So I think the only point I want to emphasize is, look, this is a fundamental goal that we have. We've devoted semesters and semesters to developmental education, in some cases 4 or 5 different semesters. The process of helping students choose what they want to do and figure that out is also extremely important, yet we devote much less attention and resources to that process. So that's an emphasis I want to make there. This is something else which Guttman does, which is another part of their intake process, which is combining developmental education or defining strengthening academic skills with this course, a college-level course in critical issues in New York City. This is the other part of their intake process. Remember I said there were the skills issues and then there's the choice issue. And so they have a kind of an integrated process that helps them not only strengthen their skills, but choose what they want to do, and all of those combine academic skills as well. So what about empirical evidence for this? All right, so there's no question that a full guided pathways model has not been tested with a random assignment study. So we're really putting together various pieces of evidence which suggest that this is successful, and this is really the iBest program in Washington State. So these examples, the first examples I'm going to give, I consider partial, right? Those are examples that combine developmental education with college-level programs. So this is an occupational program, really comes from adult basic skills funding, and essentially incorporated into the occupational preparation are the types of academic skills that are necessary for those students. So we've evaluated this and we found that it was successful and definitely increased the outcomes for students, both in being successful in college level courses and ultimately also in these particular cases with employment. The ALP, the Accelerated Learning Program, which was started at Community College of Baltimore County. This is probably the most famous developmental education reform. Peter Adams, the person who put that together, has now retired from CCBC, and I think he's probably, I just ran into him on the road. I'm sure he's on the road 2 or 3 times a week talking about this. I'm sure there's some colleges in New Jersey that have introduced this model. The model is a combination, that is, students who are assessed into developmental education are put into a college level course, and there's a companion course for those students that helps them. This has been much more, these data show that, of course, many more students enroll. I mean, 100% of these students enroll in college level courses because that's what the program is. Those students pass at about the same rate as other students do, and so that if you combine the same passing rate with much higher enrollment, the actual number of people who are successful in college level courses goes way up. So once again, but that's just the beginning, right? That's just the first part of their college level program. And I think if you looked at the CCBC overall outcomes, they haven't improved that much. So I think that's important. But nevertheless, these are the first steps. This is you've probably seen, this is the Statway program, which is a similar type of program in which students are put earlier into college level programs. And so that you can see they get 51% of their students successfully through a college level course, whereas in these colleges, the traditional one gets students who are in these levels of math developmental education in 2 years gets 15%. So, I mean, I think in general there's a lot of examples now of these so-called co-requisite programs, or programs that actually lower the cutoff score and put more students into developmental education with some kind of support. And I think initially, as far as evidence for getting them through the college level course, that's quite strong now. So that is, and now I want to emphasize that this as the first step. I want to see developmental education integrated more closely with college level courses, and this is the first step to do that. I think we have to extend that on through the rest of their college career. This was a Florida State example. I mean, Florida State and Georgia State were really pioneers in the guided pathways movement. And this really points to the fundamental question. So they first started out with students who were enrolling, and they did an analysis of demand, and they found a lot of students, they need one course to graduate, but they can't get that course. They may have to lose another year to do that. So they did an analysis and straightened that out, and it didn't have that much of an effect. So then they developed clear pathways for students. So they introduced the notion of maps for all students, and that had some effect. But it turns out that students didn't follow those maps. It's great to put them there. And then finally, they essentially made those, they didn't make them a requirement, but they basically made those the default. And if a student wanted to move off that path, they had to go essentially get permission from it. And they found that with that, and then also they emphasized milestone courses. If you want to be a nurse, you ought to do well in Biology 101. If you don't, then you need to address that set of issues. So the point here was they did maps, but then they didn't make them mandatory, but they made them the default. So you didn't have to do that, but if you didn't do that, you needed to have a reason to do that and go argue with somebody about that. So I think that's another crucial aspect. Okay, ASAP. Anybody heard of ASAP? All right, so a few people have heard of ASAP. ASAP is a program in New York City and there was actually a random assignment study of this, and it essentially doubled the 3-year completion rate. From the control group had a completion rate of 21%, and the experimental group was 40%. So this was a significant program. Now this is a very extensive program. It includes a lot of counseling, and it also provides the students are fully funded. So most of them have Pell Grants, and so it's not that expensive to sort of top up their financial aid, and they get Metro cards, so if you're from New York, you know that's a very important aspect about that. But to get their Metro card, they had to show up at advising. So that was a way to get them to advising. Now, this is an expensive course. Right now, they're running it at about 30% more than a typical program would cost. But the emphasis I want to make is that this is a program that takes students all the way through. It's not just the beginning. Those students are in this program until they graduate. So whatever problems they have after they have successfully got into the college level courses, they're dealt with by those counselors. So I think that's the fundamental question there. Gutman Community College, a brand new college. Well, it's now 3 years old. Those of you who know manufacturing, it's a greenfield college. They actually created it so they didn't have to deal with whatever existing structures there were that might have been resistant, et cetera, to that. And they've just gotten their 3-year graduation rates. Now, this is very descriptive. I'm a researcher, and this is not a highly controlled comparison, but the 14% is the completion rate for a typical for average CUNY full-time student, and their completion rate was 49%. So there's a lot of other things behind this story, but I think that's just encouraging. And in a lot of ways, Gutman is probably the college that most closely adheres to all of the kind of notions of guided pathways that we've been influential in the design of that college, so that's perhaps not that surprising. All right, these are just some examples. All of the Student Success Centers, or most of the Student Success Center states, I was just at Michigan at their Guided Pathways Student Success Center conference. So over the next few years, we are going to get lots of examples of this, and there'll be a lot of opportunities for us to study how effective this is. So these are just some examples, but I think this slide is probably 9 months old, and we could do 2 or 3 slides like this that give the examples. So there's many different places, and there's a lot of experience that's being accumulated. Okay, just to go back and emphasize that this is a focus on reform that takes the entire student experience. So these are just, when you think about the different steps, and the idea is to start how it is you want those students to end, it's completion or transfer, where their objective is, and plan backwards from that. And do that in an integrated way. Don't be satisfied if you just have a nice program for one of these steps. I'll have 3 takeaways from this. So restructuring, taking account of the entire student experience, not just a segment. Crucial issue. That's a philosophical approach, really, to what this is. Build reform around simple and coherent college-level programs of study, including transfer. I didn't talk very much about transfer. Most students want to transfer. If you think that they need a nice guided pathway to their objectives, that has to cross the transfer divide. That means that we need to have interaction and communication among faculty in the 2 sets of institutions, because often that's what stands in their way. I actually think it also needs some support from state policy and state legislation, because that kind of gives a framework for that, but nevertheless, I think some places have made a lot of progress in terms of communication between the faculty and the 2 sets of institutions at the program level. So that's important. So that's the second point about that. And finally, the point I've emphasized a lot, which is the intake process. The goal of helping students choose and successfully enter a program of study, a college-level program of study. So there's many different aspects of this. It's there's a whole book you can read. I hope you read it. You can get it on Amazon. But I just want to emphasize these 3 elements, because I think they're crucial to this, and I think in many ways they kind of change our perspective on how it is that we can improve the outcomes for our students. So listen, I'm right across the river. I love to come to conferences that I don't have to get on a plane. So I'm very excited about what you're doing, and I hope that we can keep in touch and be involved. I'm on the advisory board, so I will be active with what you're doing. We're interested in looking for research sites as well, and doing what we can to help you out, because we think this is important, really exciting. I think it's It's an era in community colleges. Larry said this at the beginning that I think is particularly exciting. You know, I think we've had a lot of reform that hasn't been effective, but I think that this is a different framework for thinking about reform in a more comprehensive way that I'm very optimistic about. So thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Dean Carla Callender from Brookdale. I've been a critic at my college for a few years of the number of gen ed courses we have or the number of courses. And the reason we have that is because faculty have clamored to get their courses to be gen ed so that the enrollment would stay up, because enrollment's been a god for community colleges. Do you have any advice on how you convince faculty to scale back the number of courses and to simplify those paths?
So yeah, that's a fundamental issue. We've had a little controversy about that over at CUNY, which some of you might have heard about. All right, there's actually, you know, we deal in the book a lot with the issue of how to get faculty engaged with this. That's a very difficult question. I think that I'm glad you asked this, because I mean, I did not emphasize a lot in my remarks about the importance of getting faculty on board. Obviously, if we're thinking about college level programs, that's the faculty, and they're going to do that. So I think that that in places that we've seen where that process has gone forward and overcome some types of opposition is that, you know, I think faculty would like to see their students successful. And if we can show them, if they can get together to work on reasonable college level programs, and that those can be shown to be successful, I think that that's the way to, you know, in many cases that overcomes some types of opposition. You know, if you have kind of a faculty problem-solving model, get faculty together to talk about that, then I think that you can make some progress on that. Now, if people are worried about their jobs, you know, that is certainly kind of an issue. I don't know what the situation is here. I know presidents have reassured faculty that they're not losing their jobs. And in many cases, I think what this has actually allowed some places to do is to actually increase their upper level gen ed courses. So that's actually been mollified some, or made some faculty members more positive about this project. So if you're getting students more directed rather than having to take 10 different random general education courses, then you actually have an opportunity in the community colleges to allow them to make progress in those areas. So that may actually be, you know, give some opportunities for faculty to teach not just their Psych 101 course, but, you know, Psych 201. So I think those are various ways to do that. But I think that, you know, fundamentally it's, here's a set of issues for our students, here are the problems that they're having. How do we as a group solve those problems? So I think that's we had an interesting case in a state that was where there was a transfer problem. And what had happened was that there had actually been some legislation which required courses to transfer. And we actually showed that despite that legislation, most of the four-year colleges did not accept those courses. Or many of those courses. So, you know, that was I think that the gen ed faculty in that case, you know, saw that there was something to work on and were then more willing to, you know, make progress in that area.
So how do you propose that a system like this in New Jersey, where the 4 years are not linked, do we work on the 2-year maps with the transfer in order to ensure that all of our courses transfer as major classes in addition to as an elective for gen ed?
Yeah, there's no question that, I mean, not only is CUNY centralized, but it turns out in their charter, the administration actually had control over the curriculum, which is most places not the case. So CUNY perhaps isn't the best example of how to do that. In states where there's no unified system, it's much more difficult. So it can't be mandated or required. I mean, I guess I think it has to be negotiations with those institutions. The leadership of the institutions have to be on board with that and pressing to do that. So I think that would basically be the way to do that. We have done some analysis about the benefits that four-year colleges get from accepting transfer students, and there are a variety of ways to think about that. One of them is that it gives them access to students, and our community college students who transfer actually, are as successful as native students, once they do that transfer. So I think that, one, we need to make an argument for four-year colleges about how they benefit from accepting transfer students. And then once again, I think we have to try to get faculty together across those institutions and discuss that from the sort of bottom up. I don't know what sort of levers there might be here in the state, legal levers of various kinds, or regulatory levers that might be used to do that. But ultimately, in the end, even with those, you'll have to get the faculties together to make those to make some sort of agreement with that.
We have the Lampet Law in New Jersey, right? Most of you may know about that. And I think that was a pretty big deal, and it has had a positive impact on the transfer of our students to senior institutions, especially on the block transfer of gen ed. But the question from Union County College is a very important one and legitimate one. I don't know if President LaPerla Morales is still in the room. She is co-chair of the larger President's Council, 2-year, 4-year public-private transfer committee. And there's no question that in New Jersey we are more challenged on the transfer of the courses in the major. And just a quick observation, as we look around the country, it strikes me that we're not alone in that, A, but B, Maricopa, it seems, has found a great partner in ASU. Valencia with UCF, MiamiDade. The point is, I think in states like ours, the best advice we can offer while working through Joanne, the co-chair of the transfer committee, and Kathy Waldron from William Patterson, who was here, is for each of our 19 community colleges to you know who your 2 or 3 best transfer partners are, best in terms of where most of your students go. And I think that in the mapping exercises that will occur later today, that needs to be the focus in the short term. I think in New Jersey, we've tried and have concluded a statewide conversation about program-to-program articulation, whether it's teacher ed or criminal justice. It's a lift in states that don't work like SUNY. So in the short term, I think the best advice is, like Maricopa with ASU and so on, that's where we're at right now, and we'll talk more about this during the mapping exercises, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think I think the notion of choosing the 1 or 2 primary transfer targets to get going, at least on that, is important. I think the examples that you give are examples that have an advantage because they're primary. I don't know what the ASU Maricopa percentage is, but it's certainly very high. So they're both, ASU is the primary target of Maricopa, and Maricopa is the primary feeder to ASU. But that has not been forced by state legislation to do that. And that's been I think they've gone a long way to developing a collaboration and guaranteed transfer regulations, really, that allow students to transfer their courses and programs into ASU. So those are definitely a good example there.
The benefits of doing guided pathway are very compelling. I have asked this question at almost every guided pathway presentation. Can you elaborate about the cost of engaging in this? Because the examples of Gutman College and even Miami-Dade, even our own CUNY Community College, all the numbers that have come out to be They are not cheap.
Okay, I think that, so I'll say a couple of things. One of them is kind of a half thing to say, which is that we are certainly set up and we're operating on the cost per enrollment. And so I don't think there's any way to get around that there will be more expenditure for that. Let me talk a bit about that. But it may be that the cost per completion comes down. So for instance, this is a famous case, is the ALP one that I gave, where they've made the cost calculations. And so while, yes, that program costs more per enrollment, the cost per completion is significantly lower. Now, I know you don't operate your colleges on the, you're not funded on the cost per on completion. I mean, maybe that's coming down the road, so that might take into account. So I think that's probably an argument that you might be able to make with the state legislature, right? You want completions. This is the things that you're forcing us to do. What are you forcing us to do? More online courses, more adjuncts, larger classes. All of those have been shown to lower completion. They lower cost per enrollment, but they lower completion. They raise the cost per completion. So I think that's one kind of argument to be made about that. I think there are other reallocations. I mean, Chicago, now once again, it's a unique situation. They have not spent more on their redesign. I think they basically got the money from that by efficiency changes, reallocations. There was like an HR office and an IT office, and every one of the colleges had a lot of administrative functions that they were able to pull together, and so save some money from that. And that they've used those savings to reallocate. So there certainly may be some reallocation. I mean, that was probably a particularly inefficient system, so there might have been some more low-hanging fruit in terms of reallocation is concerned. So I think that places that have done this have had to spend more on advising and counseling. I don't think there's any real way around that. I think that if you have simpler programs, then that will make the advising burden less. But I still think that will go up. So I think, I guess in the end, we're not saying this is going to be cheaper. The CUNY, the ASAP is 30% more expensive. They're working to get that down. I think that's ultimately a major goal for that reform. But I think that we're also, the writing is on the wall in some sense about whether we will have the luxury to continue to kind of do what it is that community colleges have been doing in the past, which is enroll a lot of students that don't necessarily go anywhere. There's more discussion about performance funding. We have the Department of Education's a website now about that they're publicizing various things about colleges. We might disagree with the types of things that they're doing, but I do think that that's coming. That as the cost of college goes up, there's more interest in whether somebody is getting something. There's a lot of discussion now about whether college is valuable and other types of things. So I think there's going to be a lot of pressure to actually improve outcomes. I think this is a road to do that. And so not doing it, I think, while in the short term might be cheaper, I think in the longer term may actually make it more difficult for the colleges to operate. So I know it's not an easy answer to that question. Most things that are, that are successful are going to cost somewhat more, and I think we have to do that. But we'll be in a better position to either talk about higher tuition or talk about higher reimbursement from the public sector if we can show how much we've improved. The ASAP example is very good. They had very positive outcomes, and so the city put more money into that, tried to fund the expansion of ASAP. And they were able to go to the city and say, look, we have good outcomes from this. This is significantly increased completion. That's something we all want to do. That's worth funding.
Well, please join us in thanking Dr. Bailey for his presentation.